Welcome, birders. This is Ed Pullen, your host on the Bird Banter podcast, where birders talk birding. I have to say, birders, I have had a lot of fun with the Bird Banter podcast so far. I've had some interesting guests. I've gotten to talk to people that I would not otherwise have had a chance to talk to, and I think you've had a chance to listen to some people maybe you wouldn't have had a chance to listen to also. It's been fun for me. I hope it has been fun for you also. And I am really jazzed about today's episode. Today, I have Bill Tweit as my guest. Bill is a guy that I heard about when I first moved to Washington and never really got to know him until the last few years. He is an incredibly smart, thoughtful birder who, in addition, is a scientist. He is a researcher. He is an author. He is just an all-round Renaissance sort of guy in terms of birding. He does great work on eBird. He is just certainly one of the top Washington State birders and just a really, really fun guy to talk to and have around. So I am excited to have him on as my guest today. I think you'll enjoy it too. So here we go. Hi, Bill. This is Ed Pullen from the Bird Banter podcast. Welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Ed. Looking forward to our conversation.
Yeah, I think it'll be fun. But what I try to do is just first ask you to just give me a little brief outline of how you got started in birding. How did how did it all get going for you?
I've been birding really as long as I can remember. My family was an outdoors family, and I just have always been interested in birds.
So, kind of
as I was growing up in Chicago, I was lucky enough to have some mentors who really helped refine my skills and teach me what it means to be a sort of a critical, careful birder.
And that you are. It's always interesting to go out with you. You lend a perspective to things. I remember one of the first times I ever went anywhere with you, we chased the Siberian excenter up north. And after we found that, we're walking along the dike at Boundary Bay, and you're mentioning the Eurasian widgeons, and I'm saying, well, I don't see any. And you're saying, well, I'm hearing them. I'm like, whoa, people can hear a Eurasian widgeon? I thought that was pretty remarkable. So anyway, that was my first birding experience with you that I remember. Anyway, why don't we start off with the excitement? Yesterday's trip was pretty spectacular.
That's putting it mildly. That was about as fun a day as you can have on the ocean.
It was.
Or birding anywhere, really.
Yeah, it was crazy.
Yes, it really was. It was just one of those, can it possibly get better? And then it did.
Yeah, it was.
And one of the fun things, of course, is that you're not just out there looking at birds, you're also looking for mammals and just seeing how the ecosystem's functioning, too. And something we didn't talk about much yesterday, but I sure noticed, was that a lot of the alcids that we were flushing out the water looked pretty darn well fed, too.
Yeah, so they were having a little trouble flying, some of them, yeah.
Yeah,
heavy.
Yeah, and that's always a good sign. It means the ecosystem's
heavy
working
with fish.
right.
Yeah, that's cool. Yeah, pelagic birding is a whole new world. I mean, it's just, for someone who hasn't been on a pelagic trip, it's just kind of amazing. You go out there and see these birds that they don't go to land except to make babies. I mean, that's all. The only reason they set foot on land. Yeah, kind of give a recap of the trip yesterday for people who don't know about it.
Sure. We headed out using what we call sort of our normal route. Which means once you leave Gray's Harbor, which is a large coastal estuary, we head pretty much straight west across a pretty broad continental shelf. And that's actually characteristic of most of Washington, is that the continental shelf is anywhere from as narrow as 20 miles off of Cape Flattery to as much as almost 35 miles or so off the southern coast, which is great for seabirds because those continental shelf areas, particularly where you've also got a boundary current, those tend to be some of the most productive parts of the ocean. And as a consequence, they really tend to concentrate seabirds. And so for us, even a slow day will still be thousands of seabirds during the, particularly during the spring, summer, and early fall, when in addition to the local breeders, we've got some of the Alaska birds and a large proportion of birds from the southern hemisphere for their austral winter, all congregating on the food resources available over the shelf.
Yeah, it is. It
And
can be shocking. Yeah.
it can be pretty awe-inspiring. Sooty shearwaters in the hundreds of thousands some days.
Yeah.
Then on the outer edge of the shelf, a couple different things happen. One is you get a phenomenon called submarine canyons, and there's several of these submarine canyons that dot the Washington Shelf, the outer part. One of them is Gray's Canyon, due west of Gray's Harbor, and we almost always try and head there on a pelagic trip, just because even if there's not much happening over the shelf, and even in a highly productive region like the Washington Continental Shelf, some days can be kind of blah. Other days can be fantastic. So even on days when there's not much happening over the shelf, maybe because hasn't been as much wind-driven upwelling lately, or the spring plankton bloom didn't come in as strongly as it does in other years, and so productivity over the shelf is a little lower. There's almost always productivity over the canyon because it doesn't rely on wind-driven upwelling as much. At the canyon, the north-south currents, as they encounter the walls of the canyons, portions of those get deflected up towards the surface, and so you get essentially current-driven upwelling, which is steadier and more predictable than wind-driven upwelling. Same is true of the outer shelf, the outer slope of the shelf itself, but because that's north-south and the currents are running north-south, you don't get quite as much of that effect as you do from the canyons themselves.
Sure.
So we headed for Gray's Canyon, and indeed it delivered in terms of as we got over the canyon, birds we hadn't been seeing much of over the shelf, like albatross and kittiwakes and Cassin's auklets, definitely increased in numbers. And what we like to do most trips is do what we call a chum stop at the very west end of the canyon. In other words, the furthest offshore end of the canyon, about where the canyon mouth really cuts into the main north-south line of the outer shelf slope.
Okay.
And we sat there for about 40 minutes, having put out our usual chum slick, which is a combination of vegetable oil with a little bit of cod liver oil. And that creates the visual appearance of an actual sort of upwelling type area on the water surface, because often upwelling is associated with a high degree of plankton. An upwelling front is associated with a high degree of plankton, and as they're predated on, they tend to release oils, and as those accumulate on the surface, you get a little bit of a sheen that marks a convergence line or a confluence line. It's natural. It's not. This isn't the same as oil slicks caused by a man-made catastrophe. And then the cod liver oil in that also provides odor that sort of smells like plankton, smells like productivity. And for a lot of seabirds that forage using a multiple set of clues, they'll use both visual as well as olfactory clues. And so that cod liver oil, particularly if there's a bit of a breeze, that scent carries pretty quickly a fairly long ways.
It is amazing to see them come in, yeah.
It can be fun watching them essentially bloodhound their way up the scent trail. And then you throw in some chopped up beef suet to actually give them another visual attractant as well as a reason to hang around.
Okay.
Slick once they land. And albatross in particular just seem to really gobble beef suet chunks like they're M&Ms. But so do fulmars and other things too. So you put all those together, and you can pretty quickly set up sort of an attractive station for birds. And of course, actually, the boat itself also functions as a visual attractant. Mm-hmm. A lot of the birds foraging out there have learned to associate fishing vessels with available seafood. And so they'll often come by and just check out a vessel, even if you don't look like a standard fishing trawler or longliner.
They probably aren't that sophisticated.
They've learned, yeah, they've learned it can be worthwhile to swing by. So we chummed there for a while, and it worked pretty well. We had some really nice close views of albatross, and some pretty close passes from kittiwakes. Later in the year, when there's a much higher diversity, that's how we often get our best views of storm petrels. And sometimes you get fulmars right below you off the stern, within a foot or two of the boat. And often other shearwaters coming in, Jaegers will swing by and investigate. But that's later in the year. In the winter, we don't expect that kind of diversity. So as we were finishing up there, our skipper, Phil Anderson, who we've been working with for, since the early 90s, actually. So coming towards 4 decades.
He's pretty darn good.
Wow. He is really good at what he does. And he enjoys this. He loves the birding. Yeah. And he loves having the birders on board. He'd been keeping track on both his radar and his AIS system, which is Automated Information System, which is a relatively new system that allows him not only to see that there's a boat out there, but actually if they're broadcasting over AIS, he knows what boat it is. He usually can tell how fast they're moving. And then so he can make a reasonable inference of what they're doing. And in this case, the boat showed up on the AIS as a small trawler, and it was moving at a speed that to him indicated that it was actually towing the net, so it was actively fishing.
Okay.
And coming towards us, still 10 miles south, but he sort of calculated if we ran for about half an hour south along the outer shelf line, which we like to do anyway, because that can be a very productive birding area.
Right.
He calculated we'd be able to intersect with them. First off, running south along the outer shelf turned out to be a good decision because we got some good views of several tufted puffins, which can be very hard for us to find nowadays. Yeah. Their population in Washington has really declined, and so it's always great to see them. And in this case, it was really interesting to see them because they were sort of partly molted, just beginning to really acquire their breeding plumage, and we got a chance to see what feathers come in first, and it was interesting to me to see that those long whiskers, the tufts themselves, come in before the white face patch really.
Yeah, they were there, and they had a bigger part, sort of bigger red bill than maybe in the winter, but not the white face patch. Yeah.
Exactly. So you can kind of see, and it's not surprising when you look at the pigeon guillemots in the Sound right now. A lot of them are kind of blotchy, but we don't get a chance to see that very often with puffins. So that was fun to see that. So we, so we worked south, and sure enough, in about a little over half an hour, pulled up towards the trawler, and Phil announced that we'd just gotten really lucky, and they were just pulling their nets. And one of the time periods when fish are most available from commercial fishing operations to seabirds is when a trawler is bringing its net in.
Okay.
And that's because, even though they're pretty good at capturing a lot of what they catch, some of what they're catching is small enough, and it doesn't have to be much of a percentage. It can be a pretty small percentage, but of a fairly large tow, a small percentage can still be a fair sizable
a lot of food
fish.
for a bird. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, and it's brought to the surface where things like albatross, which can't dive, can actually get to it.
Right.
And in this case, the tow had been mostly a rockfish, and they caught a fair number of one species of rockfish that's fairly small, and so the smaller individuals were popping out of the net, out of the trawl, the mesh that forms the trawl, and just floating on the surface. And oh boy, was that ever an albatross bonanza.
It was crazy. Yeah.
And that's where a very good day became a great day.
Yeah, it was extraordinary.
In addition to 90 black-footed albatross, which is a huge number for the winter, 10 or 20 is a good number for the winter. In addition to the 90 albatross that had found this boat, 90 black-footed albatross that had found this boat and were clearly following it, waiting for it to do exactly what we witnessed, which is bringing the trawl net in, there were either 5 or 6 laysons, which is also a really exciting number. Yeah. And then, of course, the star of the day, the avian star of the day, those 2 young short-tailed albatross.
Yeah.
I still haven't done all the reading I need to do to figure out whether they were a 1 or 2-year-old, but they were certainly.
I got some photos, and they had perfect feathers. I mean, just So it makes me think maybe that was their first year, but I don't know if that's a valid assumption.
Well, some of the back feathers were looking fairly faded, whereas on
Yeah,
the
I was looking at
first
the primary. I was
individual,
looking at the flight feathers, so maybe I should look at the others.
and I would love to see. I'm looking forward to seeing your photos of the outstretched wings.
Yeah,
'Cause that'll help
send
a lot
those. I'll
in
send those to
trying
you
age it.
before I send them to eBird. I was going to do that today, but I didn't make it happen. But
Yeah.
they're
Well, I
they're-
wouldn't have had a chance until
Yeah,
now anyway,
yeah.
so this is
so-
perfect.
but all their flight feathers
but
are
the-
pristine. Yeah.
And that is one of the really great advantages of digital photography, is the ability to get these really high-quality images of things like outstretched wings and learn things about molt that, for an endangered species like short-tailed albatross, there's just not that many specimens in the world's museums.
Sure.
And so the kind of data that we can collect using this kind of digital imagery it's of lasting scientific value too. People can sort through the Macaulay Library, which is the library of the digital images that go into eBird.
Right.
They can sort through that library and really learn valuable things about. I mentioned the puffin transition already, but also looking at the short-tailed albatross plumages too.
Yeah. I'm excited to hear what some of the people who know what they're doing say about them because, they're.
Well, I am too.
Yeah, I'm sure there were better
photographers
photographers than me on the trip, and there'll be some great shots because they were just
they're really
crazy
well.
obliging. I have pictures with all three albatrosses in a full frame picture. It's just ridiculous.
Yeah, I like that. With my not so good camera, I got a great shot of a laysan right in front of the short tail, that big hulking immature short tail, and then this black-footed albatross kind of looking out from right behind, almost peeking out from right behind the
don't hurt me.
the short tail, saying, "Hey, I'm in the picture too."
Yeah,
it's really great.
Yeah, when you don't see the short tail, the black tails look so big, and now they don't look so big.
Yeah, it's pretty fascinating how that bird can really put the others into a essentially a more petite category. Yeah.
I was just shocked. I mean, I've never seen one of those before, and I was kind of not on the side of the boat that they showed up first, and I was kind of looking over people's shoulders, and I'm like going, it's you just knew what it was. You saw that bill, it was like, holy mackerel! That big bubblegum pink bill is just shocking.
Yeah, that's really twice the extent of a black-footed or laysan albatross beak, particularly in thickness.
It's just ridiculous.
Much stouter.
Yeah, really cool.
And then the whole head and neck are also much more massive. It's a
big bird. It's a big bird, and it's got quite a story. You kind of told us
a little bit.
Yeah, you sort of told us a little bit about the conservation status issues. Can you just summarize that? That was pretty cool.
Sure. The population had been systematically reduced, decimated might be a better word, largely by hunting for feathers. The adults were just basically killed as they were on the breeding grounds. They breed in the Northwest Pacific, the islands around several of the islands around Japan, and they'd been exterminated from all but one of the islands through the systematic over-exploitation for the feathers. And the reason they're being exploited for the feathers is the adults have this beautiful snowy white plumage. They do have some black on the upper parts of the wings, but the back and the underparts and even the head are the snowy white, but then the head had this sort of goldeny, mustardy suffusion on it as well. So it's just a really gorgeous plumage. And that was apparently very attractive to Japanese and I think others who were interested, much like
the millineries
in fashion
for the egrets and herons are here, yes.
Really similar, yes. And so as a result of that, as well as some hunting for meat, particularly by sailors and others,
right.
They disappeared off of several of the islands that they bred on, and finally the last island that they were breeding on, the island of Torishima, is a volcanic island. And unfortunately, the volcano erupted, mudslides were created in the eruption on very sudden mudslides, and the remainder of the world's adults were buried in that mudslide.
Oh my gosh!
There may well have been a few adults at sea, but our best understanding is that really what was left of the population, and it was
so that's
already
why
a
there
very
were
small
only
population.
subadults left.
Yeah,
Wow.
yeah. To the best of our knowledge, all the adults were essentially extirpated.
Do you know what about when that
in
was? That was like 50s, 60s?
No, it was a little earlier than that.
Earlier, okay.
And I should have looked it up,
okay.
and
No,
I can't remember.
I'll figure that out and make a note in the podcast notes that I can do. Sure.
Yeah. Oh, that would be great. Thank you. I look forward to hearing that. And it was really only, though, in the 70s when globally we began to think a lot more about conservation, and the Japanese government led an international effort to begin to recover them. And it's a several-fold effort. One was to just provide them with complete protection on the breeding areas, and that took a while, as you can imagine. Also, offer them as complete as possible protection from mortality in fisheries. And worldwide, there had been a problem, particularly with longline gear and albatross, that as the longliners set the gear, they usually have bait on each hook that they set on the bottom of the ocean.
Right.
And the bait's usually fish, and albatross fairly quickly figured that out and would try and grab the bait off the hook and themselves get hooked and then drowned. And now that's clearly a problem for all kinds of albatross, but clearly for a species that's already absolutely on the brink of extinction, like short-tailed albatross, a huge problem. And so some fairly visionary leaders of the longline fleet in the North Pacific realized they didn't want to have the ultimate demise of a species as their heritage, and so they really pushed development and then implementation of various ways of reducing that. And they developed some techniques for setting those long lines that were highly effective at reducing albatross entanglement to almost zero.
Oh, that's really cool.
There's still an occasional one, but it's nothing like what it was. And so that source of mortality, and then of course that began to be exported some worldwide,
right,
benefiting many of the southern hemisphere albatrosses, which were also suffering the same fate. But the combination of factors of the recovery efforts on Tereshima, and as well as I also began to do a lot of banding, and then as soon as satellite tags became available and usable, they began also satellite tagging. In many cases, they were as part of the providing the best possible breeding environment on the island, having scientists on the island 24/7 to ensure no loss to predators, to ensure no further human intervention, etc. All those efforts really began to pay off, and the population slowly grew from functionally darn near zero, but it took several years just to get breeding adults back into the population even. And then it began this wonderful period of almost exponential growth. And that's what we've been seeing for the last couple of decades.
Right.
When I first saw my first short-tailed albatross off Washington in January of 1990, the population was still in the low hundreds, and it was truly this sort of goosebumps bird as this bird flew out of the west towards us at the west end of Gray's Canyon. And just, as if it was coming out of the mists of extinction almost.
Yeah.
Just in that period of time from 1990, and that was the first modern day record of a short-tailed albatross since early in the 20th century.
Yeah, I looked at the
last specimens were taken.
I looked at on the Rare Birds Committee reports, and it was like over 100 years with no sightings before that. It's just amazing.
And that's a great measure of the depths to which that population fell. But then since then, it's just been a wonderful testament to global efforts at conservation and how successful they can be. And now the population's in the low thousands, and that's fantastic.
Huge difference.
I noticed Gene Robles, my
co-leader,
one of our co-leaders, indicated that he just checked, and it's higher than I thought. But that's, again, just a testament to how quickly that population is rebounding. And so we're still very much on what I call sort of the power curve of population growth.
Sure. I mean, if you have 800 breeding pair or something, that's maybe 600 or 700 birds a year. I mean,
and now on 2 islands, which is also exciting. The Japanese government has spearheaded efforts to establish a second colony on an island much further south.
Which is huge. There's only one more volcano, and that's that.
Exactly. That could really set back our efforts.
Sure.
And you never want a population just breeding on one island.
Of course
that's
not.
Always risky.
Of course not.
So many reasons.
Yeah. Well, that's a
but
great.
It's all working. And
that's a great success story. That's a great success story.
Yeah.
And Bill, you work in you're the Department of Fish and Wildlife. Is that how you kind of came privy to some of this information, or did you just study it or read it? How did you learn all this stuff?
You're exactly right. Professionally, one of the fisheries I deal with is the fisheries in the Bering Sea and the Gulf of Alaska.
Oh, okay.
And they pay a lot of attention to short-tailed albatross and seabird issues in general. So I hear about it on the job. I hear about it as a birder, and then obviously pay attention to the science too.
Yeah. So that's a great story. Bill. Give us Westport Seabirds is a major contributor to the world's pelagic bird database. It's tell us kind of the story of Westport Seabirds. When I first moved to Washington, I thought you must be an old guy because I saw your name and Terry Wall's name as two people doing the pelagic seabirds. I guess I met him on a trip and I saw they must be about the same age. So when I first met you, I said, he's young.
Terry really, it's mostly Terry's vision for this, but he, every vision starts often with a suggestion.
Sure.
And in this case, Terry had been doing shore-based seabird work for a while as a citizen scientist. Terry is, in my view, he's one of those fantastic amateur naturalists, almost cut back to a century ago in England.
Sure.
When folks weren't
more Renaissance men. They were a scientist and
types,
also an artist and an explorer and a physician, all sorts of things. Yeah.
And so Terry is a businessman from Bellingham who, in his spare time, did a lot of work with another sort of dominant name in Washington ornithology, Zella Schultz. They were banding gulls on Protection Island for years, and I think even doing some work on the rhinoceros auklets breeding there, and sort of doing what they could to study seabird usage of Washington waters, but more from shore, because that's what they had the resources for.
Sure.
In the late 60s, the meeting of the North American Ornithology Societies, I think primarily the American Ornithologists Union, as well as some international, mostly seabird experts in, either Vancouver or Victoria. I can't remember which. Anyway, in advance of that meeting, they contacted Terry and asked if there was any way Terry could organize a trip out onto the ocean for them. And so Terry got to work and found a charter boat out of Westport that was willing to do that. And so he took several of the world's most notable seabird scientists, including a Brit named W.R.P. Bourne, who was one of the world's most famous seabird scientists at the time. It was very much a pioneering field, and officers of the British Navy were some of the
they had some time at sea.
Prolific seabird observers, and Dr. Bourne received a lot of their data. Anyway, Terry was able to get them out on the ocean, And Dr. Bourne said, "Well, this is a wonderful thing you have here. This is a fantastic resource you have here. Are you going to do you come out here regularly?" And Terry sort of had to say, "Well, no, I organized this for you guys. Never really done this before." And Dr. Bourne said, "Well, you got something here," and also said, "And while you're out here, you should be counting birds. You shouldn't just be out here."
Checking them
enjoying
out.
yourself,
Sure.
You should actually be counting. And it was that seed that really became Westport Seabirds. Terry took that challenge on. Initially, Dennis Paulson provided some help,
Right.
as well as a couple of Bellingham area birders, at least one of whom has gone on to become a seabird scientist in his own right. Doesn't work in Washington anymore. And his name is currently escaping me. But
That's okay.
And so from there, Terry grew Westport Seabirds. It took off pretty quickly because at the time, by then it was the early 70s,
Sure.
when it really began to take off.
There's also the explosion of interest in birding on the West Coast. I mean, California especially, but here too.
Exactly. And the explosion of interest in birding on the ocean, too.
Sure.
When I came to Washington in 1973, I'd been able to go on some of the very first pelagic trips on the East Coast, off of Montauk, for instance.
Mm-hmm.
Well before we knew about getting out into the Gulf Stream or anything else.
Sure.
There was, back then you could go out of Monterey, you could go out of Montauk on the East Coast, and that was about it in terms of regular trips. So these were some of the first. Among the first real regularly scheduled trips, and I'd already after spending a summer on the Farallon Islands off of San Francisco, working as a volunteer for Point Reyes Bird Observatory, my love for seabirds, which was sparked on pelagic trips off Montauk and on the Blue Nose Ferry in the Gulf of Maine.
Yeah.
Just really,
Yeah. And unfortunately, that's a fast boat now. Yeah.
Yeah, unfortunately, because it was a great boat before. You could look straight down on Wilson's and Leach's storm petrels or red-necked and red phalaropes and really see the differences in flight by looking straight down off the bow end. But anyway, that's another story. So I just, my second day in Washington, I was on board, back then it was the Apollo was the boat we used, with Terry. And after a few years, felt really privileged when Terry asked me to start helping to lead those trips. Developed a really close friendship with Terry, somebody I really admired. I think he's really influenced how I do science as a professional in the natural resources field of fisheries, as well as how I view the role of citizen science and how that intersects with birding.
Yeah. I mean, you've certainly been a local leader in the eBird movement, so that shows up.
And boy, is eBird ever a great example of the power of citizen science properly conducted. So I'm a real passionate believer in that, and that all sort of. It was Terry who really not just planted the seeds, but helped nurture those seeds of the importance of. Have a good time while you're birding, but also
why don't you make some notes?
Time, find ways to contribute.
Yeah.
Pardon?
As it make some notes and keep track. Yes, good.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So Westport Seabirds now has, I think I heard, the longest continuous pelagic birding database in the world.
We do.
That's
we do.
pretty
Terry
big kudos.
Really got systematic about it, starting really right around 1970. We're coming up on 50 years of anywhere from 10 to 20 trips a year with data collected the same way. Terry laid out a really good, sort of robust data collection protocol. Nowhere nearly as rigorous as you'd get if you put two trained ornithologists on a research vessel. But because we have customer service to think of,
you kind of have to support the boat.
We don't have willing customers,
and I'm a willing customer.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's always fun.
Yeah,
it's fun.
Yeah. So the collection protocol that Terry laid out, very nicely balanced, meeting birders' customers' needs with a very pragmatic approach to data collection that, as I say, over the years has proved really valuable for tracking the ups and downs of a fair number of species out there.
Yeah, it's been terrific, and the experience for anyone who wants to go seabirding in Washington, it's, besides being the only resource, it's a great resource. I mean, Westport Seabirds is just a first-class organization. Phil runs a great boat.
Yeah, it's wonderful.
All the leaders are just very talented and personable, and it's a pleasure. It's a real pleasure. Now that I've learned not to get sick, it's even more of a pleasure. But yeah. So
that really and seasickness comes and goes out there. That's for sure.
It does.
But certainly, it's something that over time you can learn to.
I've learned my recipe.
Train yourself to handle.
I've learned my recipe. I go down the night before. I get a good night's sleep. I take my drugs the night before. I take my meclizine in the morning. I don't stop eating the whole trip. I don't go inside. I look at the horizon, and I just do fine. But we all have.
And it is amazing how an albatross can cure seasickness too.
Oh yes,
particularly a rare albatross.
One of the early trips I went on, everyone was sick. It was a rough day, and I think it was one associated with a WASP convention down there many years ago, everyone on the boat was sick. I'd say half of the people were laying in the aisles, green in their own excrement. It was just awful. And then a bird would come, and everyone would pop up and look at the bird and back to the ground. It was just. And I'm trying to hold it together.
Yeah. We do. We're very careful about doing it well. We never go out if it's unsafe. That's
I mean, I'll vouch for that. I've been on the boat and been sent home. So Phil is very. He just does it right. Yeah, does it right.
So it's never an issue of safety, but there is always that issue of essentially passenger comfort. And sometimes we find that when we get out there, conditions aren't as good as we thought, just from the standpoint of actually being able to bird.
Yeah.
And so you do have the occasional trip like that where, and I'll get sick on those as well. But those are
the exception. They're the exception.
What you remember are the great trips.
The two short-tailed albatrosses together. I'll remember that one. Yeah, for sure. Bill, I want to get away from Westport Seabirds just a little bit because you've done some other really cool stuff. Tell us just sort of briefly how Birds of Washington, the Breeding Bird Atlas, came together. That's a huge undertaking that you were involved in too, wasn't
it? It is, but let me be clear. Okay. The Breeding Bird Atlas for Washington was actually a separate effort that was done a few years earlier, and that was spearheaded by Phil Maddox, who was secretary of the Records Committee for quite a while and a Washington birding force for quite a while, as well as a couple of scientists at Washington State University. We were fortunately able to take advantage of that work. But both Terry Wall and I have the fundamental belief that state bird books play a very important role in. Excuse me. And what I mean by state bird book isn't an identification guide, but a book that describes what we know now about the status, distribution, usage, conservation status of all the known species in the state.
Right.
And prior to our book, there had been two previous works published. One there was, and both for their time, very good books. The first one, and it's still in a lot of ways the most enduring one, just from the standpoint of really wonderful literature, was written by William Leon Dawson and John Hooper Bowles. Dawson was a professor at Ohio State University who traveled extensively through the West, and also wrote a book about California birds. Mm-hmm. John Hooper Bowles was a Tacoma area businessman who struck up, and an amateur ornithologist who struck up a close working relationship with Dawson, and together they wrote that. And the prose, much of the prose is Dawson's prose, and it's just wonderful reading. It's that, it's a century-old pros. They didn't know a lot scientifically about the birds, but they sure knew how to write evocative descriptions of behavior and habitat and all that. It's still great reading.
There's some people who can just write, It really makes it nice.
Yes. Yeah. 50 years later, so half a century later, the Birds of Washington was updated, and I'm having a momentary blank, but by Jewett et al., Stanley Jewett. He and his collaborators were professional ornithologists, but several of them were hired by groups like the U.S. Biological Survey or the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, so actually working within government. And had been commissioned to do a fair amount of survey work. And so what they were writing up was both the increase in knowledge from active collectors, active ornithologists, as well as their own work within the agencies that they worked for.
Okay.
Jewett also participated in work on the Birds of Oregon, done roughly at the same time. So both states got a good update midway through the century, midway through the 20th century. And when I came to Washington, that was the state book, and it was essentially what did Jewett et al. Say about the status of sagebrush sparrow, for instance.
Sure.
And that's what really formed our understanding of status and distribution of Washington's birds for quite a while. But in the last 50 years, the change has been tremendous, both in terms of our knowledge
and
our ability
habitat
to collect
and
data, but also equally habitat. The habitat forces have been. When Jewett et al. Was written, the Columbia River was just undergoing the transformations, the building of the dam.
Into a series of lakes.
Into a series of lakes, for instance, and therefore the tremendous changes in agriculture on the east side as well. And so both Terry and I recognize that half a century is probably about as long as you want to go, particularly when the pace of change is as fast as it has been for Washington State for the last half century.
Yeah.
And that it was time for a new book, a new summary. We did some checking around. There didn't appear to be any other folks interested or equipped to take it on as a project, and so decided we'd put up the word that we were starting to do that. And we got quite a bit of cooperation from museum folks, a lot of cooperation from folks within federal and my own agency, and then a lot of birders were really interested in helping contribute too.
Cool.
So, and then we also took on as a third partner Steve Mlodinoff, who's another birder, very, very skilled field birder, and at the time was a real force in Washington State birding. And so together, the three of us sort of shepherded this new reference work through. I'm still very proud of what we did.
Oh, I own a copy. It's a beautiful book.
Reviews.
Yeah. It's
When and wonderful pen and ink sketches by a Washington State artist, Scott Mills, who's also one of our leaders.
One of your leaders.
And then
Shawneen.
Shawneen Finnegan, who's now living in Portland, and just also a very talented bird artist.
She's a
great to have that.
Wonderful birder too. I was on I did that searcher trip, that pelagic out of San Diego, and she was one of the kind of last second invite leaders on that. And she was really good. It was fun.
She really is, with a really great people touch.
Yeah. She was definitely the of the five leaders, she was definitely the most easiest to talk to. Let's put it that way. Yeah.
So
cool.
I think highly of her. And great to have her in the Northwest, along with her husband Dave Irons.
She's on. I think she's on both Washington and Oregon Rare Birds Committee, if I remember correctly.
Correct.
She's
correct.
Pretty much a well-known expert for sure.
She really is.
Yeah.
So anyway, it all came together. I think we avoided some of the temptations from some state books, which is to try to include everything, try to include identification and notes on nests and foods and things like that. Because a lot of that information is sort of better done elsewhere. I think we did a good job of staying really focused just on status and distribution.
Yeah. It's the Bible.
As I look in the rearview mirror, I wish. Well, I'm glad we did it when we did it, because I still think half a century is about as long as you want to go.
Sure.
But I sure wish eBird had been available. I
Wouldn't
wish
it have been
eBird
nice?
had started 10 or 15.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. The amount of information that's been generated between when that book was published now almost 15 years ago, and it's just largely through eBird, it's just a staggering amount of additional information. It's got me thinking a little bit about, well, how would I write a state book again now?
Would you even? Would you even? I mean, it'd probably be an online resource now. You know, with links to
That's the interesting question.
I don't know.
I think that's a fascinating question.
Yeah.
And I still think that a living resource that's constantly updating is wonderful and very useful. But what you lose is that fixed point to measure from.
A snapshot, yeah. A snapshot in time, yeah.
Exactly. That you're then tracking from. And you can go back in and kind of laboriously recreate it within eBird. But what we had was we were writing from a fixed point in time of the early 1950s. So sort of
right,
just post World War II. And they Jewett et al. Drove a fixed stake in the ground, and we could measure from that.
Mm-hmm. That is
we drove a fixed stake in the ground for early in the 21st century, and you can now measure from that.
Exactly. Yeah, there's a strong argument for having both resources. Yeah, for sure.
I think that's it. Yeah, I think that's exactly it, and that's how you synthesize both that wonderful sort of always evolving, always updating, living kind of database that eBird is, with the ability to say, this is how much things have changed over 20 years,
yeah.
30 or 50 years.
That's a great perspective. Great perspective, Bill. You're pretty involved in eBird. What do you do for them? What do you do with them, I guess, besides enter a lot of eBird lists? I'd
like to do more, but right now I'm part of the eBird review team, the Washington State review team.
Okay.
Which is mostly a group of young from my perspective,
yeah.
Folks who've been birding now in Washington for 1 to 2 decades, but are still youthful in terms of their field abilities.
Mm-hmm.
Fantastic eyes and ears,
yeah.
and just keenly aware of the details and nuances of birding that make a great birder when you are that aware and that alert to the
sure.
small changes and the small things. And so that it's sort of a privilege to be associated with that group, and also kind of enjoyable to be one of sort of the voices of the elders in that group too.
Mm-hmm.
Help them sort of stay a little channeled and focused, but at the same time just admire their intelligence and their acumen
and energy, tremendous energy, yeah.
And their energy, exactly. And they're the heart of the review team. And then I also help out with what's called the hotspot review, which is sort of the geography end of eBird,
okay.
which we'll see how that fares over time. But right now, the way eBird is designed, it still functions a lot around. I mean, you can define any place anywhere, and that's one of the beauties of eBird. But the data much of the eBird data are most useful when they're regularly collected from the same spots. And
fixed
the
spots,
hotspot
yes.
facility really helps support that development of those kinds of data sets where
I learned that
maybe different birders, but they're hitting the same area.
Yeah, I learned that when you and I can't remember her name from from the state too came down and talked to us about eBird and the Pacific Northwest portal and how, don't just drop a pin, find a hotspot that's right beside your pin because that's more helpful. So I remember that. Yeah.
And that's what I want to be able to do more of, is that kind of outreach. I'm looking forward to trying to restructure some things, and I'm not sure I'll be able to pull this off, but I'd like to restructure some things and do some more of that kind of direct outreach that we did a little bit of, and help more with training people, both how to put more useful data into eBird and equally how to get more as a birder out of eBird. I'd like to help eBird Northwest be a tool for really two-way communication. And for a lot of birders right now, eBird is one-way communication in terms of sending data in.
Right.
And what they get out of it is list maintenance and
rare bird
as
alerts and stuff like that, yeah.
Rare bird alerts, or looking for, if you're traveling, for instance, where do you see a target species?
In terms of trip planning, it's wonderful, yeah.
But I'd like to help birders see how their data are being used on a local scale. The National eBird crew has been doing some really good work with developing new tools, and then giving birders kind of a peek at how they look. And I don't know how many of your listeners have seen their dynamic migration maps, but they're beautiful, and there's so much information conveyed in those. But it's a handful of species that you can really get them for, and many of them are not Pacific Northwest species.
Right. East Coast bias.
And not everything has to be that way.
Yeah.
Exactly. There's a lot of other ways you can pull information sort of systematically out of eBird, and so that's one thing I want to do more of, is help eBird Northwest readers understand. So, for instance, I've got an article that's mostly finished about last winter and the palm warblers and swamp sparrows.
Yeah, it was quite a winter. Yeah, it seemed like.
And it leads to all kinds of questions about.
Is it just because we're learning the chip notes, or are there really more? Yeah.
And those kinds of questions as well, exactly. Was it just detectability, or was it a real difference? And if it was real, how different was it than some of the other winters? Those kinds of things that North American birds used to do in a sentence or two. eBird Northwest is an opportunity to take several paragraphs, maybe even do a graph or two and a little statistics test even.
Yeah.
Really dive into it a little bit more and help birders understand how, you probably got a little tired of putting in your details for why that was the fourth palm warbler of your season, or if you were lucky, of the day. Why it's important to take that little bit of extra time to document it well, how that ends up getting used.
Sure.
And that's kind of, that for me, that's fun. It's also really exciting.
It is. Well, I'm excited to hear when you start doing that. I want to learn that stuff. Yeah. So that would be good for me. That is for sure. So what do you see in your near-term future, Bill? We'll kind of wrap up. I appreciate all of your time. What do you mentioned a little more, possibly more involvement in helping people learn how to use eBird. Do you have any plans for the next months, years that you want to share at all?
Keep going out on the ocean.
Keep going on the ocean. Okay.
But also, I think most of my plans really do. I love what I do now, and just keep doing a lot of what I'm doing now. But the ability to go to some more WASP conferences, or maybe some of the other regional birding festivals, and put on mini workshops about eBird, maybe even some eBird help clinics for folks who are struggling with aspects of it. Keep nagging eBird National to make some of the improvements they're working towards.
Yeah, we have a pet peeve on that, of not being able to list put non-listable introduced species in your database. If you do, they kind of screw up your lists, and a lot of us use eBird for the lists, and it's a kind of that seems like such an easy fix, but obviously not.
They promised recently that they were very close to having that fix out, but I'll believe it when I see it, but it's a really important fix. It's a pet peeve, but it's also it's going to help eBird.
Real ecological thing. I mean, it's important to know where these introduced species are at and how many there are, but I don't enter them. And I think a lot of birders don't, you know. Yeah.
Exactly. And birders can really track them if they don't feel like they're gunking up their list.
Exactly.
And I get why. I mean, I don't like listing having a species on my list that I know that bird was an escaped cage bird.
Exactly.
But I also know that escaped cage birds can and do turn into real populations.
Exactly. And if 100 people over the next year see those, wow, maybe it wasn't just one escaped cage bird, sure.
Right, yeah. Right. And that's what eBird is perfect for, is helping us track how those populations get their start.
Really cool.
So, yeah, really looking forward to those kinds of things. So
if you need a trial audience for any of your classes, let me know. I can get ABC together, and we're nearby. We can get you an audience. Because
and that's a great group. You bring up a very good, because they're keen, they're smart, and they're interested in having birding be something more than just a pleasant day in the field or a great way to relax. They're interested in, at least some of the time, taking it to another depth.
Yeah,
we all have days when we just want to watch the chickadees and not think about anything else. And those are good days too. But
exactly.
Yeah.
So, Bill, I'm going to wrap up. Can I put out if people want to get a hold of you, how would they do that? Do you have Facebook or any kind of social media or web page or anything you'd want to make public, or you're easy enough to find and don't want to be any easier?
The best way, I'm still just old-fashioned enough that I do email well, and the other things not so well. So the best way to reach me is just my Gmail account, which is just the very simple bill.tweit, Tweit.
At Gmail. I'll put that link in the podcast notes. Bill, thank you so much for taking the time to be on with us. I know you've been traveling and super busy, and had a whole pelagic trip to lead yesterday, and it looks like you're probably going to be the eBirder for this. So you've got a lot of eBird work to do to get all of those lists in. So thanks so much for being on with me today. I appreciate it, and love having local talent.
Well, thank you so much, Ed. First off, it was just great to relive yesterday, because, oh my gosh.
What a day.
Don't get days like that very often. What a day.
And even nice weather and sunny skies and calm seas. I mean, even the peripheral stuff was great.
Not quite sure what we did to deserve that, but it must have been good.
We were living right.
But I also
right.
love the chance to talk about the parts of birding that I get so passionate and excited about.
Your passion shows so nicely. Thanks so much, Bill. You have a great day.
Great. Take
Bye-bye.
care.
Well, that wraps up the Bird Banter podcast, episode number 8, and what a fun time talking to Bill Tweit. Bill is one of those people that is so insanely smart and just fun to be around, and just a super nice guy and so talented. It was always fun to be around him, and it's just fun to listen to him. I feel like I learn something every time I'm within hearing range of Bill. So I hope you enjoyed the Bird Banter podcast, episode number 8. Well, the Puget Sound local birding talents so far have been stellar guests on the Bird Banter podcast. Bruce LaBar, who's a close longtime friend of Bill Tweit's, was my guest on episode number 3, and I think you'll really enjoy his birding story. Ken Brown, my mentor and longtime birding friend, is the guest on episode number 2. His story's a good one, too. Check out those 2 episodes. I think you'll enjoy them. Be sure to subscribe to the Bird Banter podcast wherever you get your RSS feeds, the iTunes Store, Spotify, Stitcher. In addition, check out birdbanter.com. It's a website where I have blog posts that relate to the episodes, so you may find photographs, additional details, other things that may relate to the podcast, or just other interesting information about birding. I'll also leave my social media contact information below, as well as links to interesting things that Bill and I talked about today. So until next time, birders, good birding, good day.